Bine ați revenit la cea de-a treia și ultima zi a simpozionului nostru. Vă mulțumesc pentru prezență, mulțumesc inclusiv elevilor și profesorilor de la seminarele de la Iași și Dorohoi pentru prezența aici în sală, la acest simpozion. Ieri, cum menționam, au fost prezenți cei de la seminarele din Suceava, Botoșani, Mănăstirea Neamț, Agapia. Sper să nu fi omis vreunul dintre seminarii. Începem cu câteva minute de întârziere, dar știți, pe de o parte suntem raportați la veșnicie, în partea cealaltă suntem în sfertul academic, deci e ok. Haideți să facem o rugăciune. Slavă Tatălui și Fiului și Sfântului Duh și acum și pururea și în vecii vecilor. Amin. Doamne, miluiește, Doamne, miluiește, Doamne, miluiește, înalt preasfințite Părinte, binecuvinte.
Pentru rugăciunile Sfinților Părinților noștri, Doamne Iisuse Hristoase, Dumnezeul nostru, miluiește-ne pe noi.
Mulțumim pentru rugăciune, pentru binecuvântare. Nu-mi rămâne altceva decât să predau microfonul pentru prima sesiune a zilei moderatorului de astăzi, domnul Cătălin Jeckel.
Vă mulțumesc, Părinte Decan. Înalt preasfinția voastră, stimați invitați, stimați participanți și, într-un cuvânt, onorat auditoriu. Este a treia zi de simpozion și chiar dacă e ultima, aș spune că este începutul unui nou gând, gândul la cea de-a 13-a ediție, firește. Cu întreită cunună, încununându-te, a preoției Părinte, a bunei mărturisiri și cu cea a cuvântării de Dumnezeu, ca un soare strălucești, învățându-ne a cinsti treimea cea de o ființă, la care Sfinte Dumitru totdeauna pomenește-ne, cântăm într-o parul Sfântului. Și această rugăciune a inspirat, cel mai probabil, și denumirea celei de-a 12-a ediții a Simpozionului Dumitru Stăniloae din acest an. Nu se poate să nu constatăm că de-a lungul a 12 ani de zile a crescut la Iași o comunitate închegată, ținută la oaltă, de iubirea împărtășită de unul altuia și de mărturisirea într-un singur gând. O comunitate păzită cu autoritate și inefabilă dragoste de Sfântul Părinte Dumitru Stăniloae. Un alt semn al acestei cerești purtări de grijă, pe lângă cel al creșterii și consolidării unei astfel de comunități, sunt, cred eu, și cele două conferințe, cea la care am fost martori ieri, a Părintelui Profesor John Baird, iar cea de-a doua, urmând a ne bucura astăzi. Despre invitatul de astăzi, oricât aș povesti, biografia sa întreagă nu aș reuși să o cuprind cu fidelitate și în totalitate. Și de asemenea, orice aș spune, probabil că nu aș reuși să surprind pe cineva cu vreo noutate. Și totuși, câteva aspecte se impun a fi evidențiate. Dr. Norman Russell este pasionat traducător din și în limbile greacă, engleză, franceză, italiană, erudit patrolog, fascinat de viețile și scrierile Sfinților Părinți ai Bisericii, îmbrăcat în veșmântul smereniei, atitudinea rigidă, inabordabilă, fiindu-i cu totul străină, dornic să descopere și apoi să îi îmbogățească pe alții. Irlandez pe filieră paternă și grec pe cea maternă, având o impresionantă bibliotecă în locuința sa din sudul Franței, din regiunea Burgundiei, de altfel un topos încadrat de coline molcomi, vii și pășuni și, cum el însuși mărturisea, vecini viticultori. Este profesor de teologie patristică la Institutul Teologic Santa Eufimia di Calcedonia din Bologna, profesor invitat al Universității Agora, Vermont și Alexandria și cercetător al Universității Oxford. Călătoria sa spre ortodoxie a început în urma întâlnirilor providențiale cu marele teolog romano-catolic, Părintele lui Buie, care l-a încurajat să aprofundeze învățătura despre îndumnezeire și acest lucru se întâmpla în anii 80. Și cu Părintele profesor Richard Price. A continuat apoi acest drum prin transformarea lucrării sale de dizertație într-o carte cu îndrumarea vrednicului de pomenire, mitropolit Callistos Ware, carte care a fost publicată ulterior la Oxford University Press în 2004, la recomandarea părintelui profesor Andrew Love. Ulterior acestui demers publicistic, St. Vladimir's Press l-a invitat pe profesor Norman Russell să elaboreze un volum care să reflecte strict concepția ortodoxă despre îndumnezeire. Astfel încât, în 2009, apare cartea Împreună lucrători cu Dumnezeu, gândirea ortodoxă despre teosis. Acest proiect a fost un pas important care, urmat fiind și de moartea mamei sale, despre care mărturisește că pe lângă învățarea limbii grecești vechi, l-a hrănit cu iubirea părinților bisericii și a culturii bizantine, a condus la convertirea sa la ortodoxie în 2011. În cercetarea sa, un loc important îl ocupă receptarea Sfântului Grigorie Palama și a teologiei sale în secolul al XIV-lea, apoi controversa isihaste și recuperarea moștenirii palamite în secolul 20 și până astăzi în spațiul occidental, dar și răsăritean. Mai multe cărți, studii, articole reflectă rezultatul preocupărilor sale. Menționez doar câteva. Învățătura despre îndumnezeire în tradiția patristică greacă, ediția originală în limba engleză, Oxford 2004, prima ediție în limba română, Doxologia 2015 și, din fericire, a doua ediție în limba română, Doxologia 2025. O carte consistentă, de referință, care cu siguranță ne aduce mult folos. Sfântul Grigorie Palama și nașterea palamismului în perioada modernă. Ediția în limba engleză, 2019 Oxford, și ediția în limba română, Doxologia 2022. Teosis și religie, Cambridge 2024. Ortodoxie și ideea de imperiu. Transformarea Bisericii Ortodoxe în Bizanțul târziu, Cambridge 2025. Acestor lucrări li se adaugă numeroase traduceri din Teofil al Alexandriei, Sfântul Chiril al Alexandriei, Sfântul Ioan Scărarul, Sfântul Ioan Damaschinul, precum și din filozofi și teologi greci moderni, Hristos Ianaras, Stelios Ramphos, Nicolaas Ludovicos. De asemenea, nu trebuie să uităm uriașa contribuție pe care Dr. Russell o are în a fi făcut cunoscută pentru prima dată în spațiul anglofon a vieții Sfântului Grigorie Palama, al lui Filoteu Cochinos, a tomosurilor sinodale care reflectă evoluția controverselor isihaste, e drept din punctul de vedere al câștigătorilor și corpusul de materiale referitoare la perioada sa de captivitate printre turci, care dau o perspectivă unică asupra relațiilor dintre creștini și musulmani la începutul Imperiului Otoman, timpuriu. Acest lucru prin volumul Grigorie Palama, Controversa isihaste și relația cu islamul a creștinilor, 2022, Liverpool. Unul dintre marii teologi și profesori din secolul trecut, care tratează teosis, este Sfântul Părinte Dumitru Stăniloae, ne asigură dr. Russell. De altfel, tot el subliniază că primele studii ortodoxe moderne despre gândirea palamită aparțin episcopului Vasilii Crivoșein și Sfântului Dumitru Stăniloae. Pe scurt, Crivoșein publică în revista Seminarium Condacovianum din Praga în 1936 un eseu despre Sfântul Grigorie Palama. La 2 ani după această întâmplare, părintele Dumitru Stăniloae, tânăr profesor la Sibiu pe atunci, publică viața și învățăturile Sfântului Grigorie Palama, având ca suport al întreprinderii sale, pe lângă textele tipărite de mine, și manuscrise palamite consultate la Universitatea din München și Biblioteca Națională din Paris. Să fie aceasta debutul recuperării învățăturii isihaste palamite de către Părintele Stăniloae? În ce cheie lecturează Sfântul Dumitru Stăniloae controversa dintre Sfântul Grigorie Palama și Varlam Calabrezul? Prin ce se diferențiază, prin ce se aseamănă, unde e inovatoare și unde complementară perspectiva Părintelui Stăniloae în raport cu cele ale altor cercetători? Vom afla cu siguranță din comunicarea domnului profesor Norman Russell, pe care îl rog acum să preia microfonul.
Ziua III, dear friends, it's a great honor to be here with you and to speak about your great Dumitru Stăniloae. It was probably at the beginning of his doctoral research that Dumitru Stăniloae first encountered the theology of Gregory Palamas. In 1928, he defended his thesis, The Life and Activity of the Patriarch Dositheos of Jerusalem and his links with the Romanian lands at the King Ferdinand I University of Cernăuți, a town now in Ukraine, but then in Moldavia. Dositheos II of Jerusalem, Patriarch from 1669 to 1707, was the most important Palamite of the early modern age and the first to have the synodal Tomi of 1341 and 1351 printed, and moreover printed in the Principality of Moldavia here at Iași. The motivation for Dositheos' publishing program, his intention, which he was unable to realize, Dositheos' intention that he couldn't do, was to publish the whole of Palamas' works. And the reason was the need to encounter aggressive Latin proselytism in the Ottoman Empire. This fact is not irrelevant to Stăniloae's own Palamite program. The ecclesiastical context in which Stăniloae encountered Palamas through Dositheos' publications, principally in 3 huge public compilations, the Tomos of Reconciliation, the Tomos of Love, and the Tomos of Joy, the first 2 printed in Iași in 1692 and 1698, respectively, and the third in Râmnic in Wallachia in 1705, was not unlike the ecclesiastical context in Dositheos' own age. In the late 17th century, Dositheos was responding to the publication of such books as the Targa by a Jesuit called François Richard, which had been translated into the Greek vernacular and was using Palamite theology as the basis for accusing the Orthodox Church of heresy. That was in the 17th century. In the early 20th century, there was a renewed interest in Palamas by Roman Catholic scholars such as Martin Jougy, who, like Richard, also used Palamas as an example of theological innovation in the Orthodox Church. Jougy maintained, moreover, that Palamism was an innovation which, although synodically raised in the 14th century to the official teaching of the Orthodox Church, had by Jougy's own time been quietly dropped, thus demonstrating the doctrinal instability of orthodoxy. Modern Orthodox studies are really a reaction to this, and the placing of Palamas at the pinnacle of Orthodox theological endeavor. In the course of his doctoral research, Stăniloae spent some time in Athens. He would have found very few people there at that time interested in Palamas. One of the chief textbooks used in the theological faculty of the University of Athens was Christos Androuchos' Dogmatic Theology. This was a Western-style handbook, sophisticated and up-to-date, that was not stamped by the provincialism then characteristic of much Greek theology. Stăniloae was impressed by it. When he became professor at the Theological Institute of Sibiu in 1929, he set himself the task of translating it into Romanian for use at the Institute. By that time, however, he was becoming much better acquainted with Palamite theology. In 1928-29, he'd been in Munich doing postdoctoral research under the Byzantinist August Heisenberg. It was there that he was introduced to a neglected pioneering study of Palamas published in 1911 by the Greek scholar Grigorios Papamichail, and this led him to the study of manuscripts containing material on and by Palamas held in the great libraries of Munich and Paris. As a result of his research on these primary materials, he became dissatisfied with Androuchos, which he came to see as not properly orthodox, but simply a Greek version of Western dogmatic manuals. The 3 months Stăniloae spent in Paris in 1930 were especially fruitful. The works of Palamas produced in volumes 150 and 151 of Ming's Patrologia Graeca were only those that had been published up to 1865 and did not include the triads or the letters of Palamas. The citations in Stăniloae's eventual book on Palamas reveal that the principal manuscripts he studied at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France were Coeslinianus 99, 100, and 101, and Parisinus Graecus 1238. The Coeslin codices, part of a collection of the complete works of Palamas made on Mount Athos at the Great Lavra in the 15th century, were bought in 1643 by Athanasius the Rhetor On behalf of the French Chancellor, Pierre Séguier, Stăniloae was the first modern scholar to exploit them. But it was another 8 years before his book on Palamas was published, because of the new responsibilities that occupied him on his return to Sibiu. In Sibiu, Stăniloae was a rising star. Coming from a small village in Transylvania and from a modest background, he had graduated with a doctorate from a prestigious university and had undertaken postdoctoral studies abroad. In 1931, alongside the courses he taught at the Theological Academy, he began writing for the weekly newspaper Telegraful Roman. This entry into journalism should not be seen as a distraction from his theological work. Stăniloae was born in the Habsburg Empire. Transylvania had only become part of the Romanian state at the end of 1918, the end of the First World War, when Stăniloae was 15 years old. Nation building round its Romanian and Orthodox core was an important part of his cultural and religious DNA. The Telegraful Roman, Romania's oldest newspaper, had been founded by the great Archbishop and later Metropolitan of Sibiu, Andreu Șaguna, in 1853, specifically as the mouthpiece of the Archbishopric in its mission to confirm and deepen the sense of an Orthodox Romanian identity. Stăniloae took over its direction in 1934, convinced that theology should not remain a discipline confined to intellectuals, but should pervade and enrich the inner life of all Orthodox Romanians. Stăniloae's major work on Palamas, the fruit of his research principally in Munich and Paris, was published in 1938 under the title Viața și învățătura Sfântului Gregorie Palama, The Life and Teaching of St. Gregory Palamas. It is the first book-length study of Palamas in any language, and although written in Romania, immediately attracted the attention of at least one Western scholar. This was Jean Guillard, who reviewed the book at some length in the journal Écho d'Orient. Guillard welcomes the book as a major contribution to the study of Palamas, which through diligent analysis puts new texts into their historical context. He's less happy with the ideological stance that Stăniloae reveals in the work. For Stăniloae, the hesychast controversy, or more precisely the Palamite controversy, of the middle decades of the 14th century was essentially a clash between Western scholasticism and Eastern mystical theology. His mastery of the primary material is evident, but it is also clear that he comes to this work with his interpretative framework already formed. His assessment of Balaam of Calabria, Palamas' first opponent, who initiated the controversy when he lodged a complaint at the Patriarchate in Constantinople in 1340 that Palamas was promoting Bogomil teaching, a dualist heretical teaching, provides us with a good illustration of his method. Stăniloae's work was based on a close reading of the primary texts. Secondary material is cited very rarely. In the first chapter, however, he takes issues with the arguments of the Italian Balaam scholar Giuseppe Schiro, who maintained that Balaam was an Italo-Greek and baptized in the Orthodox faith. Stăniloae does not cite any specific work of Schiro, but he's probably referring to his 1931 article, I rapporti di Balaam Calabro con le due chiese di Roma e Bisanzio. Relying entirely on statements by Palamas and Nicephorus Grigoras about Balaam, Stăniloae concludes that Schiro's arguments are weak and that Balaam was an Italian and not a Greek unit. The weakness of Stăniloae's own conclusion is evident from the fact that he relies only on the statements of Balaam's opponents or critics, taking them at face value. Palamas and Grigoras, however, are not neutral witnesses. Even before the synodal trial of 1341, it was strongly in Palamas' interest to discredit Balaam as a spokesman for orthodoxy by accusing him of Latinophronia. Later, after the formal condemnation not of Palamas but of Balaam instead in 1341, Grigoras, who came later, needed to distance himself from Balaam if he was going to make his own opposition to Palamas legitimate and credible. Philotheos too, Palamas' friend and encomiast, who later became a patriarch of Constantinople, also refers to Balaam as pretending to be orthodox in a text with which Stăniloae was familiar. From the Palamite point of view, Balaam was a thoroughly bad lot. Yet, shortly after his arrival in Constantinople in 1330, he was made Igoumenos of the Akataleptos monastery. He was subsequently sent by the Emperor Andronicus III on diplomatic missions to Avignon and Paris. On the doctrinal front, he successfully upheld the Greek position on the Filioque in a disputation in Constantinople with a delegation sent by Pope John XXII. Scholars today follow Schiro. It is agreed that even though Varlam signed his works Varlam Italos, considering himself homogenes with the Italians, he was brought up in the Greek faith and reconciled himself to the Latins only after his condemnation by the Home Synod of Constantinople in 1341. Since the time of Stăniloae's pioneering study, it has also been generally agreed by scholars that the Hesychast controversy, certainly during Palamas' lifetime, was an internal Orthodox affair. Yet Stăniloae never revised his early characterization of the controversy as a clash of Eastern and Western theological mindsets. In the last year of his life, in 1993, his life and teaching of St. Gregory Palamas was issued with a new preface. In the new text, he makes the following points. 1. The controversy occurred through the clash of Western scholasticism with the traditional religious thought of the East. 2. The doctrine of St. Gregory Palamas has formed modern orthodoxy and must be taken into account in any serious discussion of orthodoxy today. 3. The Eastern mystical tradition, with its emphasis on deification as the goal of the Christian life, is more profound than the Western tradition with its emphasis on the imitation of Christ. 4. The Palamite distinction between the essence and the energies of God is fundamental to Orthodoxy's mystical theology and much superior to the Thomist view of God as actus purus, which renders him an abstract entity. And finally, a Romanian translation of the complete works of Palamas is much to be desired. Those are the 5 points he makes in his new preface of 1993, just a few months before he died. On the question of the nature of the isihaste controversy, few would interpret it today as a clash of Western scholasticism with the traditional religious thought of the East. John Meindorf, in his classic book, St. Gregory Palamas and Orthodox Spirituality, first published in French in 1959, does speak about the opposition between the essentialism of Palamas' adversaries and the Christian existentialism of the isihaste doctor, not presenting it as an East-West issue, but still seeing the controversy in ideological terms. More recent scholars have deepened our understanding of the historical context, the way in which we see the isihaste controversy today as a conflict that evolved from the first challenge of Palamas by Barlaam of Calabria from a Platonist perspective which had absorbed, by then already absorbed, Aristotelian logic, to a second challenge by Gregory Akindinos from a conservative Orthodox ecclesiological viewpoint, then to a third challenge by Nikiforos Grigoras, again from a Platonist perspective, and finally, after Palamas' death, to a fourth challenge by Prochoros Kidonis, not a Western scholastic, but using elements from texts of Thomas Aquinas that he had been translating. In these matters, as one would expect of a book published 87 years ago, Stăniloae's life and teaching of St. Gregory Palamas has been superseded. Groundbreaking as the book was, and accurate in the details of its historical narrative, it was nevertheless a child of its age. Well, that's that, you might say, and put the book back on the shelves. But there's more to be said about it. First, very few writers, perhaps none, can transcend the circumstances of their age. Second, the book was never intended simply as a scientific monograph. Third, its role as the springboard for the whole of Stăniloae's dogmatic and spiritual theology is of primary importance. Let's take each of these points in turn. At the time when Stăniloae was writing his Palamas book, the ecumenical movement was barely stirring. In the Roman Catholic camp, there may have been courageous souls like Dom Lambert Baudouin of Amay and later Cheftonia, who sought to promote corporate union with the Orthodox by fraternal dialogue. But more typical were the Jesuit Michel d'Herbigny and the Assumptionist Martin Jougy, already mentioned, both of whom enjoyed the personal favor of Pope Pius XI. D'Herbigny saw the Russian Revolution of October 1917 as a golden opportunity to proselytize in Russia unhindered by the Orthodox Church, destroyed by the Bolsheviks, and persuaded the Pope to approve and support his plan. Jougy, who was professor of dogmatic theology at the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome from 1917 to 1952, was immensely learned in Orthodox theology, but saw the Orthodox Church at best as a very unreliable path to salvation, and like d'Herbigny, believed that the only worthwhile strategy was to encourage individual conversions. His influential article on Gregory Palamas, published in the Dictionnaire de théologie catholique in 1932, which paints Palamas as the inventor of a new religious system, is cited by Stăniloae in the life and teaching of St. Gregory Palamas, as is his equally influential article on the isihaste controversy, first published in Echo d'Orient and adapted for the same fascicule of the Dictionnaire. Stăniloae found Juji, in addition to the Greek scholar Papa Michael, invaluable for establishing the chronology of the chief events of the controversy, but he was also fully aware that Juji was using Palamas as a stick with which to beat the Orthodox. The context of Stăniloae's work at this time, however, is not only to be sought in learned publications. His Transylvanian background is also relevant. Ever since the capture of Transylvania by the Habsburgs, after the defeat of the Ottomans in 1687, the ethnically Romanian Orthodox of the region had been on the front line of Catholic Orthodox conflict. In the 17th century, the Romanians had no place alongside the privileged three nations, the Hungarians, the Saxons, and the Jeckel, with their officially recognized Protestant and Catholic churches. Jesuit missionaries saw this as fertile ground for proselytism. In 1698, the Orthodox Metropolitan of Transylvania, Anastasie Angel, with his Holy Synod, largely as a remedy for the disenfranchised status of the Orthodox, accepted union with Rome, becoming the Greek Catholic community, or the Romanian Unified Church, the Biserica Romana Unita, with the officially recognized political status that, in the Habsburg context, went with it. Subsequently, the Greek Catholics played a prominent role in the cultural movement known as the Transylvanian School, with its pioneering work on the study of the Romanian language and culture. Transylvania was thus at the center of the early struggle to establish a Romanian identity. Until the First World War, there was pressure on Transylvanian Romanians to convert to Eastern Rite Catholicism. When Transylvania became legally part of Romania as a result of the Treaty of Trianon of 1920, the advantage passed to the Orthodox. Stăniloae's doctoral thesis and subsequent work on Palamas may thus be seen on the level of Transylvanian ecclesiastical life as a contribution to the post-1920 pushback against Uniatism. On the national level too, this was a period of the refashioning of Romanian culture and the strengthening of Romanian identity in the new Greater Romania. I'm carrying coals to Newcastle in many ways, but those of you who are not Romanian might be interested in this. As part of the consolidation of this identity, the metropolis of Romania, autocephalous since 1885, was raised in 1925 to the rank of a patriarchate. The politics of the interwar years in Romania are complex and still controversial. But we need to set Stăniloae's work in this period in its broader context. The 2 decades from 1920 to 1940 were an era of political volatility in Romania with frequent acts of violence by the far right. In 1927, the Legion of the Archangel Michael, the Iron Guard, was founded as a militant ultranationalist movement and quickly became the 3rd largest political party in Romania. A thinker closely associated with this party was the journalist poet and theologian Nikifor Crainic. Stăniloae first met Crainic at his ordination to the diaconate on the 8th of October 1931. Stăniloae's bishop, Metropolitan Nicolae Balan of Sibiu, was a prominent supporter of the Legion at the time, and Crainic became a close friend of Stăniloae. When the Iron Guard was banned in December 1933 by the government of Ion Duca, who was assassinated shortly afterwards on the 29th of December, Crainic was arrested. Stăniloae wrote in support of him in the Telegraful Roman. What impressed him most about Crainic was that he strongly promoted the idea of mystical theology as of the essence of orthodoxy. Indeed, Crainic had been instrumental in the creation of chairs in ascetical and mystical theology in Chisinau and Bucharest, the first of which Crainic himself occupied from 1926 to 1932. Stăniloae was also impressed by the way Crainic was able to break out of the academic ivory tower. 7 years later, Stăniloae wrote, Nikifor Crainic is the first Romanian Orthodox theologian in the modern era of our history to bring theology out of its confined and remote circle of specialists, presenting it in a form that commands the attention of the intelligentsia in general. To be preoccupied with mystical theology, to be digging out the barriers that shut off theology from the rich stream of tradition. Stăniloae could identify with that. Moreover, anti-Catholicism was taken for granted at every level of society. The first patriarch of Romania, Miron Cristea, who also became prime minister on the 11th of February 1938, the year in which Viața și învățăturii Sfântului Grigorie Palama was published, had been a bishop in Habsburg, Transylvania, and despite the Romanian Concordat with the Vatican, signed on the 26th of May 1929, never shed his virulently anti-Catholic views. In the context of the interwar years, Stăniloae's work on Palamas was therefore bound to be strongly anti-Catholic. How was it then that in his 1993 preface, he was still expressing the same opinions? The answer lies partly in the ecclesiastical isolation of Romania during the Ceausescu years. It was only through the World Council of Churches, founded in 1948, that Orthodox and Protestants, and later Orthodox and Catholics, began to establish warm personal relations and learn from each other. During this early period of ecumenical contacts, Stăniloae was deprived of his professorship and from 1958 to 1963 was confined to prison. In 1968-69, at a time when the Romanian regime was trying to improve its international image, he was allowed to go abroad and use the opportunity to make his first visit to England. He was well received at Oxford and was impressed by the Anglicanism that he encountered there. His friend and obituarist, the Anglican priest Donald Olchin, speaks of his openness to learn from the West, saying that although he could be severely critical of aspects of Western theology, he was always ready to learn and to receive from the traditions of Western Christianity. The word always, in Olchin's assessment, must be interpreted to refer only to the years in which he knew Stăniloae personally. Openness to learn from the West in matters of faith is not a characteristic that can be discerned in Stăniloae's work at the beginning of his career, nor in the circumstances of the time could such openness have been expected of him. Stăniloae's personal contacts with Western theologians came late in his life. But even then, despite the warmth of the relationships that he established, there is not much evidence that he found the thinking of these theologians relevant to his own work. Commenting on the 3 volumes of Stăniloae's dogmatic theology, which were published in Romanian in 1978, Father Andrew Louth records his impression that there is little real engagement with Western theology in Father Dumitru's dogmatics, though there is a readiness to point out its deficiencies. This underlying conviction of the deficiencies of Western theology seems to have endured to the end of Stăniloae's life, and is the reason why in his 1993 preface to the Life and Teaching of St. Gregory Palamas, he not only fails to revise his assessment of the Palamite controversy as an East-West conflict, but actually re-emphasizes it. Turning now to my second point, the character of Viața și învățătura Sfântului Grigorie Palama as a piece of scholarship, I would say that to call it a scientific monograph is to miss the point. I think it's significant that although Stăniloae undertook his research on the manuscripts immediately after his 1929 doctorate, the resulting book was not published until 1938. This was no doubt partly because of the pressure of his work as a new professor at Sibiu and also as a journalist on the staff of Telegraful Roman, but more importantly, in the early 1930s, the books Keros had not yet come. I've already referred to the ideological stance that is clearly discernible in the book. By the late 1930s, it was apparent that Roman Catholics were occupying the Palamite scholarly high ground and were using this as a base from which to launch attacks on orthodoxy. The formidable Juji had not only contributed his incisive articles on Palamas and the Palamite controversy to the 11th volume of the Dictionnaire de théologie catholique, published in 1932, but had also issued his magisterial Theologia Dogmatica Christianorum Orientalium ab Ecclesia Catholica Dissidentium, published in 5 volumes from 1926 to 1935, which was consulted by Catholics from the Pope down when they wanted information on orthodoxy. Then there were the Jesuits, Irénée Auxerre and Sébastien Guichardin, with La méthode d'oraison isihaste and Le problème de la simplicité divine, published in 1927 and 1933 respectively, both, like Juji, painting Palamite theology as quasi-heretical. Where was the Orthodox response? There'd only been one before Stăniloae, and this was Father Basil Krivoshein's journal article on Palamas ascetical theology and gnoseology, originally published in Russian in 1936 and translated into English in 1938 and German in 1939. Krivoshein's work is excellent, but is concerned specifically with the practice of the contemplative life and is based only on the texts available in Ming. Stăniloae's book came on the heels of Crivoshain, but despite its being based on a personal study of the manuscripts and receiving a warm reception with certain reservations from the Byzantinist Jean Guillard, it did not have the same impact as Crivoshain's much briefer essay. Viața și învățătura Sfântului Grigorie Palama is clearly designed for a Romanian rather than an international scholarly audience. Besides being written in Romanian, nearly half of the book, 135 pages out of 300, consists of translations into Romanian of texts of Gregory Palamas that Stăniloae had himself transcribed from manuscripts, though without specifying which, because even the Greek text had not yet been edited. These texts consist of the second and third treatises of the first triad in defense of the holy isihastes, which had been published in the yearbook, already published in the yearbook of the Adrian Theological Academy of Sibiu in 32-33, the Apologia, and the fifth antiheretic treatise against Akindinos. What is noticeable about these treatises is that they all concern the distinction between the essence and the energies of God, and discuss at length the deification of the Christian by participation in the divine energies. It is Palamas' teaching about humanity's ultimate destiny that Stăniloae wishes to transmit in this part of the book, confining the historic analysis strictly to the first part. Thus, although Stăniloae's book is historically the first monograph to be written on Palamas, it was not intended as a contribution to international scholarship. Its purpose was to contribute to the spiritual formation of the faithful. In pursuit of this goal, the oversimplified presentation of the Palamite controversy as an East-West conflict was a help rather than a hindrance. My third point is that the Viața și învățătura Sfântului Grigorie Palama may be seen as a kind of manifesto, setting out the basic presuppositions of all of Stăniloae's future work. That is not to say that Stăniloae chose to adopt a strongly Palamite position for polemical purposes. Rather, he is steeped in the patristic tradition which he sees as coming to spiritual fruition in Gregory Palamas. In his otherwise excellent book, The Neo-Palamite Synthesis of Father Dumitru Stăniloae, Father Adrian Agaki gives a sensitive analysis of the different ways in which Stăniloae develops his insights into Palamas' teaching, but ends on a negative note, emphasizing Stăniloae's lack of a critical spirit, his excessive use of a doxological style, his minimal furnishing of bibliographic references, and his blurring of the boundary between his own thinking and that of Palamas, regarding all this as poor work for a supposedly objective analysis. And so it would have been if Stăniloae were a Western academic. In his theological writing, however, his doxological style and his blurring of the subjective-objective boundary are positive strengths. When we read Stăniloae, we are reading a modern church father immersed in the church's mystical tradition. As Father Agaki himself says, he lived what he was doing. His daughter Lydia recounts how he used to love shutting himself in his study, losing himself in his own thoughts, making the ideas that come from his reading his beloved friends. He describes his approach to his work himself in the introduction to his orthodox dogmatic theology, unfortunately omitted from the English translation. He says, "In doing this work, we let ourselves be guided by the manner in which the Holy Church Fathers understood the Church's teaching. But when interpreting the dogmas, we also took into consideration the spiritual needs of souls that hunger for salvation in our own times. We have tried to present the teaching of the Church in the spirit of the Fathers, but we've also tried to understand it as they would today, because the Fathers would not have neglected the needs of our times, just as they did not neglect the needs of their own times." In the spirit of the Fathers, this is the neo-patristic program. Not simply to report the teaching of the Fathers in a suitably scholarly manner, but to do theology in the spirit of, or according to the mind of, the Fathers of the Church. For Stăniloae, to do theology in the spirit of the Fathers meant above all to explicate their mystical theology, from the early Fathers to the final flowering of this mystical theology in St. Gregory Palamas and his immediate disciples. The first work that Stăniloae undertook in pursuit of this program, and by program I don't mean a carefully planned academic project, but rather a spiritual vision of the path leading towards the ultimate fulfillment of the human person in union with God through participation in the divine energies. This program was a vastly expanded and annotated translation of the Philokalia, basing his work initially on the Greek Philokalia of St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain and St. Macarius of Corinth, published in Venice in 1782. Stăniloae published 12 volumes of patristic texts with his own commentary from 1946 to 1991. The additional material consists of classic ascetical texts of the early monastic tradition, as well as more demanding texts of mystical theology important to the later hesychast tradition. The latter group includes Maximus the Confessor's Questiones et Dubia and Questiones ad Thalassium in vols 2 and 3 from 1947 and 1948 respectively, Simeon the New Theologian's 225 practical and theological chapters with selections from Ethical Discourses 1 and 5 in volume 6 of 1977, and 2 treatises from Gregory Palamas Triad 2, sections 2 and 3, along with Palamas on the divine and deifying participation, which, dating from 3041-42, is the first Greek treatise, this one of Palamas, to be written specifically on deification. And this is also in vol 7, which also was published in 1977. By these demanding texts, amply annotated by him, particularly in the later volumes, Stăniloae was aiming to continue and to develop the work of St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, whose intention was not just to educate monks and ascetics in the Greek mystical tradition, but to deepen the spiritual life of an educated generation of Ottoman Greeks who in the late 18th century were becoming increasingly exposed to the ideas and values of the European Enlightenment. In this endeavor, Stăniloae was not working in a vacuum. First, Romanian monasticism had a philocalic tradition that went back to St. Paisie Velichkovsky, who died in 1794. He brought his own Slavonic philokalia from Mount Athos to Moldavia in 1764. Stăniloae concludes the 8th volume of his translation of the Greek philokalia in 1979 with a survey of Romanian hesychasm in the 18th and 19th centuries, giving accounts of St. Paisie's spiritual father, the elder St. Vasile, of the skit of Poiana Maruli in Moldavia, who tonsured Paisie on Mount Athos in 1750. St. Iosif of Varatec, who died in around 1830, a hesychast and disciple of St. Paisie, and St. Kalinic of the monastery of Cernica, who died in 1868 and became Bishop of Râmnicu Valcea in 1850. Second, after Stăniloae was forced in 1946, under pressure from the newly installed communist government, to resign his academic and journalistic posts in Sibiu, he moved to Bucharest to assume the chair there of ascetical and mystical theology. It was as a result of this move that he came into the contact with a contemporary hesychast movement known as Rugul Aprins, burning bush. Rugul Aprins refers to the burning bush that the flames did not consume, which Moses saw on Mount Horeb. This was the name adopted by a group that began from 1944 to gather around the remarkable figure of Sandu Tudor. The group, drawing from Bucharest's cultural elite, used to meet at the Antim monastery in Bucharest for prayer, principally the hesychast prayer of the heart, centered on the Jesus prayer, and for spiritual discussion. Stăniloae began to attend meetings in 1950. In September 1958, he was arrested as part of a clampdown after the departure of Soviet troops from Romania on any group that promoted mystical ideas. Mystical, in the official mind, was connected with the Iron Guard, of course, in this period. And he spent the next 4 years in prison. Sandu Tudor, who'd been arrested in June 1958, died in prison from the beatings he received. Stăniloae was released in January 1963, and by October of the same year was able to resume his teaching duties. The 28-year gap between the 4th and 5th volumes of the Philokalia are the years of Rugul Aprins, imprisonment and rehabilitation. It was a different Stăniloae who resumed the series in 1976, a Stăniloae who'd encountered Christ crucified and resurrected. It has been pointed out that the phrase Philokalia Romanasca, Romanian Philokalia, appears for the first time now. The annotation, which is now in footnotes, not in endnotes as formerly, becomes a meditative dialogue with the translated text. The result, as Father Andrew Louth puts it, is a symbiosis between scholarly commentary and creative theological reflection. But above all, there is the desire to communicate. In Volume 7, published in 1977, Stăniloae engages with Palamas thinking more deeply than before, commenting at length on triads 2.2 on prayer and 2.3 on the holy light, and also on the treatise on divine and divinizing participation the Hagioritic Tomos, which he correctly takes to have been authored by Palamas, and the 150 chapters on topics of natural and theological science, etc., a major work of Palamas' maturity dating from 1349-50, in which Palamas revisits and comments on themes discussed in his previous treatises. In Stăniloae's footnotes, one sometimes senses strongly what his own more recent experience had taught him. Here's an example from Volume 7, Note 228. He says, "But the victory over pusillanimity caused by pain cannot be obtained except through the heroism of accepting pain. This is because running away from pain is also a pleasure. It does nothing for the sanctification of the body. Tiredness and pain do not stop the soul from praying, but carry the soul and uphold it in prayer. By contrast, the pleasure of the senses, by giving the feeling of power, of self-sufficiency, will stop the soul from praying." The mature Stăniloae had clearly lived the teaching of Gregory Palamas. In view of the deep engagement with Palamas' thinking evident in the 7th volume of the Romanian Philokalia, it is perhaps surprising that we do not find Palamas in the foreground of Stăniloae's 3-volume Orthodox Dogmatic Theology, published in the following year, in 1978. This is probably because, as Adrian Agaki suggests, Stăniloae's ascetical and mystical Life of the Orthodox Church, first published in 1947 and reissued in 1973 under the title Orthodox Moral Theology, which places Palamas very much in the foreground, was envisaged by Stăniloae as the 4th volume of his dogmatic theology. Moreover, a major theme in the dogmatic theology is the universe as the macrocosm of man. Accordingly, while taking the Palamite essence-energy distinction for granted, and also making use of elements of Palamite anthropology, such as Palamas' teaching on the superiority of humanity to the angels, Stăniloae relies principally on Maximus the Confessor, who has much to say, not so much on the universe as a microcosm of man as a microcosm of the universe. He also brings in Dionysius the Areopagite, Cyril of Alexandria, Nicholas Kabasilas, and Simeon the New Theologian into the discussion to produce what has rightfully been claimed a magnificent neo-patristic synthesis. It is the Orthodox Moral Theology volume, translated into English as Orthodox Spirituality, that we get the fullest sense of Stăniloae's engagement with Palamas. In the first edition of 1947, he had devoted a chapter to Bulgakov's Sophiology. In the second of 1973, as pointed out by Agaki, he drops this chapter from Bulgakov and instead brings in Gregory Palamas more fully. In the interval between the two editions, he'd been working on the Palamas texts that he included in Volume 7 of the Romanian Philokalia, and this has evidently borne significant fruit. Palamas becomes his main guide for the relationship between apophatic and cataphatic theology, for the role of the divine energies, and for the nature of deification. To structure his discussion in Orthodox spirituality, Stăniloae uses the classic divisions of the spiritual life: purification, illumination, and perfection, first set out by Dionysius the Areopagite at the beginning of his treatise, The Celestial Hierarchy. Although Stăniloae occasionally makes some critical remarks about the Western tradition, particularly in relation to the hostility of several contemporary Catholic writers to Palamite theology, the threefold division of the stages of the spiritual life is a factor common to both the Eastern and the Western traditions. This is because Dionysius was translated into Latin as early as the mid-9th century by John Scotus Eriugena and became an important source for the spiritual teaching of Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, Meister Eckhart, and the Rhineland school of mystical theology. In the Christian mystical tradition, Dionysius is a common father of both lungs of the church, the Western as well as the Eastern. The same cannot be said, at least not yet, about Gregory Palamas. The third part of Stăniloae's book, however, which bears the Dionysian title Perfection, is dominated by the thinking of the great Hesychast teacher. It's not that Stăniloae focuses exclusively on Palamas, but that Palamas sets the terms of discussion of each chapter and is complemented by a symphony of patristic voices, principally the Iadokos of Photiki, Maximus the Confessor, Isaac the Syrian, John Climacus, and Simeon the New Theologian. One of Stăniloae's concerns is to show that Palamas is not an isolated innovator, but the summation of the whole patristic tradition on union with God as the goal of the Christian life. Underlying the third part of the book is Palamas' Triad 2, Treatise 3, on the Holy Light, which Stăniloae was working on at about this time and published in translation 4 years later in the 7th volume of his Philokalia. The climax of this final part of Orthodox spirituality is chapter 36 on love, knowledge, and the divine light, which begins with a long quotation from Triads 2, 3, 33 on how union with God, even if it is called knowledge, transcends the powers of the intellect. So the vision of light, says Stăniloae, can never be put in the framework of the pantheist idealism of Plato, Plotinus, or Hegel. It's not the culmination of a process that develops our spiritual powers. It's the product of direct intervention by God, a rapture by the Spirit. He also says, Barlaam admitted only the impression of perceptible images and so considered the divine light too is such an image. Palamas knew better, not only from the fathers, but also from personal experience. Stăniloae concludes the chapter with some magnificent passages from Simeon the New Theologian, for whom the divine light is only the sensible aspect of divine love, this warmth of love which becomes light springing from the action of the Holy Spirit. 3 years later, in 1976, Stăniloae returned to the theme in an article on the Orthodox interpretation of the divine light published in the journal Orthodoxia. Here he engages with the Jesuit Jean Danielou, the Dominican Marie-Joseph Le Guillou. In his classic work, Platonism, Platonisme et la théologie mystique, published in 1944, Danielou had drawn attention to the Platonic origin of Christian language about the beatific vision. Le Guillou, by contrast, in an article that appeared in Estina in 1974, Lumière et la charité dans la doctrine palamite, had not been prepared to attribute a Platonic background to Palamas' teaching on the divine light. Stăniloae welcomes this move as an important step towards accepting that the vision of the divine light is not a created grace, as Latin theology would have it, but is the manifestation of the love of the personal God towards us, and invites Le Guillou to take this further step. Stăniloae concludes from his examination of the work of the two French scholars that the problem with the West lies not so much in the essence-energies distinction as in the Western understanding of personhood, simply in essential terms. In the second part of his article, Stăniloae goes on to discuss the significance of divine light in Orthodox worship. Adrian Agaki is not satisfied that he's dealt with this topic adequately, but nevertheless is rightly impressed by his new willingness to engage with Western scholars without his customary polemics. To return to Orthodox spirituality, the book concludes with an important distinction between deification in a broad sense and deification in a strict sense. Deification in the broad sense begins with baptism and encompasses the entire struggle of the Christian spiritual ascent from the ascetic struggle, from the initial struggle with the passions to the final experience of the divine light. It implies the full realization of the latent spiritual powers implanted in humanity at its creation. The continuity of deification beyond the ultimate limits of human nature to the infinite is what Stăniloae calls deification in a strict sense. There's no hard boundary between the two, because the whole process, from baptism to the transcendence of the laws of nature, is a movement from the image of God ever more fully into the likeness of God. Citing Mira Lot Borodin, Stăniloae refers to this potentiality for deification which is implanted in humanity as something fundamental to the God-centered anthropology of the Christian East. With deification in the strict sense, however, the operations or energies of human nature cease. This is the deification of Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus the Confessor, and Gregory Palamas, which Roman Catholicism can't understand, says Stăniloae, because it doesn't know the difference between the divine essence and energies, without which such deification means merging with the divine essence. This is not, as in the past, hostility to Roman Catholicism as such, but is the consequence of identifying a real difficulty in equating Eastern and Western traditions on deification. The Hesychast tradition, as articulated by Gregory Palamas, maintained that the light of the Transfiguration makes the beholder another sun, communicating divinity in its fullness, without destroying the distinction between the Creator and the created, only in virtue of our participation in the divine energies, not in the imparticipable divine essence. Stăniloae is not without allies on the Roman Catholic side. It's widely claimed that the West and the East have equivalent doctrines of deification, or theosis, as it's often called, but an important paper given at a conference on deification in 2004, published in 2007, Gösta Hanonsten, now Professor Emeritus of Systematic Theology at Lund University, distinguishes between the theme of theosis and the doctrine of theosis. Different elements of the theme of theosis are found in most Western traditions, but the doctrine of theosis relies on the anthropology of the later Greek fathers and the Palamite distinction between God's essence and energies. Stăniloae's arguments have substance and are not simply polemical. It's regrettable that Stăniloae did not see fit to revise his opinion of the 14th century isihaste controversy as a confrontation between the Greek patristic tradition and Western scholasticism. This position is no longer tenable. But, as I indicated at the outset, it's exceedingly difficult for any scholar to transcend the limitations of his age. And as Father John Bear reminded us yesterday, the great caesura of the transition of centuries from the 20th to the 21st divides us from all that. Stăniloae was a great theologian whose Romanian Philokalia and Orthodox dogmatics in particular stand as lasting monuments. If there are some aspects of Romanian culture in the ethnocratic period between the two world wars which he failed to discard, that is hardly surprising. This year, in the centenary of the establishment of the Romanian Patriarchate and the 32nd year after his death, the Church has seen fit to glorify Dumitru Stăniloae among the saints. Axios esti. If I may end on a personal note, I was a graduate student in Oxford when Stăniloae visited the university with Father Plemedeala in 1968-69, the term of 1968-69, on his first trip abroad after his release from prison. There was great excitement at the visit of a famous confessor of the Christian faith. I attended his lecture, which was in Romanian, understanding, like almost everybody else, only the odd word here and there that resembled Latin. Later, I sat near him at dinner, sensing a man with a profound interior life and just happy to be in his presence. There's a saying in the Apophthegmata about three fathers who used to go and visit Blessed Abba Anthony every year. Two of them used to question him about their thoughts and the salvation of their souls, but the third always remained silent and didn't ask him anything. After much time had passed, Abba Anthony said to him, "You have been coming here to see me for such a long time, but you never ask me anything." The other replied, "It is enough for me to see you, Father." For me too, it was enough to see Father Dumitru. Thank you.
Vă mulțumim mult pentru această conferință foarte densă, domnule profesor. Și cred că nouă nu ne-a fost de ajuns doar să vă ascultăm până acum și se simte nevoia de a continua dialogul în care ne-am așezat printr-o sesiune de întrebări și răspunsuri. Și Părintele Profesor Gheorghe Holbea deja s-a anunțat.
Mulțumim mult domnului profesor pentru această prezentare duhovnicească. A fost Aș vrea doar să fac o remarcă. În ceea ce privește teologia Sfântului Grigore Palama, introdusă în manualul de teologie dogmatică, trebuie să revenim asupra unui aspect. În 1958 a apărut manualul de teologie dogmatică în 2 volume pentru institutele teologice, un colectiv de autori. Teologia Sfântului Grigore Palama cu ființa lui Dumnezeu și energiile dumnezeiești necreate este prezentă în acest manual, 1958. Din păcate, numele părintelui Dumitru Stăniloae este șters pentru că în 1958, când apare teologia dogmatică, părintele este arestat. Nu s-a mai revenit asupra acestui aspect, deci este pentru prima dată, și o spun responsabil, pentru prima dată, când în învățământul academic ortodox, și mă refer aici prin comparație cu teologia academică grecească, atunci dominată de Panayotis Trembelas, care, l-a ignorat pe Sfântul Grigore Palama, ba mai mult, a reluat ideile lui Martin Jugy, conform cărora teologumnele lui frizează uneori erezia. Este pentru prima dată, iată, în plină epocă de prigoană comunistă, când într-un manual de teologie ortodoxă academică apare teologia Sfântului Grigore Palama. Deci sunt 2 volume, 1958, colectiv de autori, și părintele Dumitru Stăniloae are 11 teme pe care le tratează în acest manual, iar teologia Sfântului Grigore Palama este o teologie centrală. Nu s-a mai revenit asupra acestei nedreptăți, pentru că manualul a fost retipărit după Revoluție, dar din nou numele părintelui Dumitru Stăniloae a fost eludat, omis. Vă mulțumim. Vă mulțumim mult pentru această minunată expunere.
Thank you very much, Father, for that clarification. And there is obviously much more that Father Dumitru knew and spoke about than you find in, at least in the English language translations that I've had to rely on.
Mulțumesc frumos, Părinte, pentru această clarificare. În mod sigur, Părintele Sfântul Dumitru Stăniloae știa mult mai mult decât am aflat noi prin traducerile făcute în limba engleză.
I should just like to add one important point about the theology of Gregory Palamas.
Aș dori să adaug un singur lucru referitor la teologia Sfântului Grigorie Palama.
We go on and on ad nauseam about essence and energies.
Vorbim foarte mult despre esență, despre energii.
Palamas would never have actually spoken about this if he had not been challenged by Varlam and his successors.
De fapt, Sfântul Grigorie Palama n-ar fi scris niciodată despre aceste subiecte dacă n-ar fi fost provocat de Varlam și ceilalți.
When we look at the totality of Palamas's work,
când ne uităm la opera Sfântului Grigorie Palama în întregime,
we see that in his letters and reports of his time in Bithynia, when he was a hostage of the Ottoman Turks, there is nothing from there about essence and energies.
vedem că în scrisurile sale și în scrierile în care povestea ce îi se întâmpla în captivitatea lui din Imperiul Otoman, nu găsim nimic legat de energiile necreate, de lumina necreată.
Moreover, in the large corpus of Palamas's homilies to his people of Thessaloniki,
iar în corpusul mai larg al scrierilor pe care Sfântul Grigorie Palama le-a redactat pentru oamenii săi din Salonic,
40-odd homilies, there's only hardly any mention of essence and energies.
în aceste 48 de predici către tesaloniceni, aproape că nu există nicio referire la acest subiect al energiilor și al esenței Dumnezeirii și la esența Dumnezeirii.
He did not need this in order to teach his people, the lay people, his people about the Christian life and the goal of union with God.
Nu a avut nevoie de această învățătură pentru a-și învăța turma despre viața creștină și despre scopul vieții creștine.
Energies, essence and energies were something, I believe, rooted in the Cappadocian fathers, but which Palamas reserved for his intellectual debates with people hostile to the isihaste tradition.
Iar această învățătură a sa despre esența Dumnezeirii și despre energiile necreate, oarecum este înrădăcinată în învățătura Sfinților Părinți Capadocieni, de care a avut nevoie în discuțiile sale intelectuale, dar care nu-i foloseau neapărat în învățătura, în predania către turma sa de credincioși.
And a final point, Palamas was not anti-Western. We know from the letters of Gregory Akindinos that he sent copies of his work to the Dominican fathers in Pera and to the master of the Hospitallers in Rhodes to inform them and to engage in discussion with them.
Și aș mai spune și că Sfântul Grigorie Palama nu era neapărat împotriva celor din Apus, pentru că a corespondat cu aceștia, i-a scris lui Akindinos și altora al căror nume nu l-am reținut, îmi cer scuze.
So we always need to keep the whole context in view when we discuss
Trebuie
Palamas.
tot timpul să ne gândim la întregul context atunci când discutăm pe Sfântul Grigorie Palama.
Așteptând o altă întrebare din sală, permiteți-mi să vă întreb următorul lucru. Există, poate și astăzi, percepția a doi mari poli în teologia ortodoxă. Poli. Teologia rusă și cea greacă. Iar între ele se resimte un gol oarecum pe care l-am dorit umplut. Credeți că prin receptarea teologiei Sfântului Părinte Dumitru Stăniloae, teologia românească ar putea umple acest gol?
When I was a student, looking at Orthodox theology, there was, as you say, there was the Russian tradition, particularly as represented by the exiles in Paris. There was the Greek tradition. In between the Russian and Greek tradition, there was a big hole occupied by Romania. Now, I see wonderful signs in recent years of Romanians taking their rightful place in the international debate. And this I would urge all Romanian scholars, engage in the international scholarly debate. Try and publish we're not going to learn Romanian, unfortunately. Try and publish your work in English or French. It would be of great help to us.
Într-adevăr, atunci când eram student, așa este, situația era exact așa cum ați prezentat-o dumneavoastră. Existau acești doi poli ai teologilor greci, ai teologilor ruși, mai ales teologii ruși aflați în exil, iar între ei doi, într-adevăr, era acest gol. Și aș spune acum că, într-adevăr, românii pot să umple acest gol. Vă îndemn să cercetați și să publicați în franceză și în engleză mai degrabă, pentru că noi, cei din Apus, nu o să învățăm limba română, dar vă îndemn să vă implicați în acest dialog intelectual pentru a umple acest gol pe care l-ați perceput între teologii greci și cei ruși.
Da. Bună ziua, mă numesc Mihail Bărsan și aș dori să punctez pentru Părintele Norman o idee. Învățătura Sfântului Grigorie Palama, înainte să fie, să zic așa, utilizată la Biserica Unită cu Roma din Transilvania a fost utilizată mai întâi la biserica ca și învățătură împotriva Bisericii Unite din Ucraina. Astfel îl avem pe ierarhul Petru Movilă, care realizează un eveniment unic, Sinodul de la Iași, și acolo se creionează, se scrie manifestul de credință ortodox. Astfel încât folosește învățătura Sfântului Grigore Palama tocmai înainte de a fi vorba despre Biserica Unită cu Roma. Privim cu tristețe la ce se întâmplă în această perioadă în Ucraina, unde avem un război între creștinii ortodoxi, unde avem un război fratricid și ne doare faptul că acest conflict se întâmplă acolo. Cred că avem nevoie de mai multă credință, avem nevoie de o învățătură corectă, avem nevoie ca Sfântul Părinte Stăniloae să înțelegem foarte bine învățătura și să ne dăm seama unde anume ne aflăm. Cred că în privința catolicismului și tot ce a însemnat el, mai ales în ultima perioadă, în care avem o serie după Sfântul, să zic așa, sau preafericitul Părinte Ioan Paul al II-lea, avem un papă care abdică, avem un papă cu viziuni progresiste și avem iarăși un papă care a avut un trecut cu multe semne de întrebare. Cred că este important să ne păstrăm credința ortodoxă, să ne păstrăm și să luăm aminte la învățăturile Sfântului Părinte Mărturisitor Dumitru Stăniloae. Vă mulțumesc!
Yes, you are quite right. We need
Aveți
to
dreptate.
Sorry.
Aveți dreptate.
Sorry. Ah, sorry. Go on.
I just said it.
No.
I said it.
You finished?
Yes.
I apologize. You're quite right. We need to preserve our Orthodox faith, but we must put the conflicts of the past in their proper context. And we do not defend our Orthodox faith through fear of the other, through the demonizing of the other. We are all Christians of the Eastern tradition and the Western tradition, each who have their own valuable points of view to contribute. And it does not undermine our identity as Orthodox to approach the others with love. That's what we must do. We must set aside. The problem with Palamite studies is that they began in the 17th century in a polemical manner, were resumed in the 20th century again in a polemical manner. We have to overcome these polemics.
Aveți absolută dreptate în ceea ce ați spus. Într-adevăr, trebuie să ne păstrăm credința și conflictele din trecut trebuie să rămână oarecum în trecut, să nu ne afecteze modul în care ne raportăm la ceilalți. Nu trebuie să ne apărăm credința prin teama de ceilalți, demonizându-i pe ceilalți. La urma urmei, cu toții suntem creștini, fie că venim din tradiția apuseană, fie că venim din tradiția răsăritană și fiecare dintre noi avem puncte de vedere valoroase prin care putem să contribuim la acest dialog teologic. Iar dacă ne gândim la controversa palamită din secolul XVII și la modul în care ea a fost reinterpretată în secolul 20, la fel trebuie să ținem cont strict și să înțelegem contextul în care această controversă și modul în care a fost reluată, cum anume s-a petrecut, care a fost contextul respectiv.
Vă mulțumim. O ultimă întrebare.
Yes. Dear Dr. Russell, it's always a great joy to see you and to listen to your words. Concerning what
Just a second. Profesor Russell, este tot timpul o mare bucurie ca să vă văd și să vă întâlnesc.
concerning what you just said about the distinction between energies and essence.
Referitor la ceea ce ați spus un pic mai înainte despre energiile
Palamite.
necreate, despre energie, despre esența Dumnezeirii în scrierea Sfântului Grigorie Palama,
As used exclusively in the theological debates and confrontations.
așa cum sunt folosite aproape exclusiv în dezbateri teologice.
We know that even Saint Gregory Palamas definitely affirms that the central idea in his teaching is divine light,
Știm cu toții
uncreated.
și Sfântul Grigorie Palama spune acest lucru, că ideea sa esențială este aceea a luminii dumnezeiești.
But I mean this distinction as a hermeneutic tool
Dar distincția aceasta ca instrument hermeneutic
in interpreting the divine revelation, divine manifestation,
modul de a interpreta revelația divină, dumnezeiască, manifestarea dumnezeiască, modul în care Dumnezeu se
the
manifestă.
possibility of communication and communion between the transcendent divine and the created human
Posibilitatea
reality.
de a comunica și de a avea această comuniune dintre latura dumnezeiască transcendentă și dintre latura creată, zidită, partea zidită.
So I do have the impression that this distinction is present in the entire corpus of the Palamite writings, even in his sermons, which you just mentioned.
Am impresia că această distincție, de fapt, este prezentă în întregul corpus al scrierilor Sfântului Grigorie Palama, chiar și în predicile pe care le-ați menționat.
Maybe he uses another terminology,
Poate că folosești o altă terminologie,
such as divine life or divine glory,
cum ar fi, de pildă, viața dumnezeiască, slava dumnezeiască,
as manifestation and communion of the divine energies.
ca manifestare și comuniune a energiilor dumnezeiești.
But I think that this distinction is always present, at least in the background of his writings.
Dar cred că
It's
distincția
always
aceasta este
there.
prezentă acolo tot timpul, cel puțin în fundalul scrierilor sale.
And I think that the genius of Palamas,
Și cred că
as
tocmai în asta constă
recognized,
geniul Sfântului Grigorie Palama.
as recognized by Father Saint Dumitru Stăniloae,
Așa cum l-a recunoscut, l-a descoperit și Sfântul Părinte Dumitru Stăniloae.
is exactly in being able to express high theological ideas and highly technical language, such as distinction between energy and essence,
Deci geniul acesta constă tocmai în exprimarea într-un limbaj rafinat a acestei înțelegeri complexe a naturii dumnezeirii și a energiilor,
in a pastoral language, and a spiritual and pastoral language,
l-a exprimat într-un limbaj pastoral și duhovnicesc,
which not only touches the thought and the heart of the believers,
care atinge nu doar inima credincioșilor,
but is also capable of impregnating our entire theological thought
dar
today.
poate de asemenea să își lase amprenta pe întreaga noastră gândire teologică de astăzi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father Porphyrios. I agree that the divine energies are always there in the background of Palamas's thought. My point is that we must not separate essence and energies as we tend to do in our Western tradition. We have religious experience and then we have these metaphysical bolt-ons, these additions. Essence and energies is for Palamas the natural completion of the patristic tradition. The natural extension of the
Can I-
patristic tradition. Yes,
can I
stop.
just-
You stop me when I get carried away.
Mulțumesc frumos, Părinte Porfirie, pentru comentariul pe care l-ați făcut. Da, sunt de acord cu Sfinția voastră că energiile dumnezeiești tot timpul sunt oarecum în fundalul gândirii Sfântului Grigorie Palama. Ceea ce vreau să spun de fapt este că nu există neapărat o separare între această idee de esență a dumnezeirii și energiile necreate în tradiția. You said that there was no separation between the energies and the essence in?
I've forgotten now.
In the tradition of in the Western tradition,
In the Western tradition,
în tradiția apăsană,
the energies is separated from all other, from the totality of Palama's thinking.
această învățătură despre energiile necreate și despre esența Dumnezeirii oarecum este separată de restul gândirii Sfântului Grigorie Palama.
I get asked by academic presses to comment on books about Palamas which have been submitted to them.
De multe ori mi se cere, am primesc aceste solicitări din partea editurilor, de a face comentarii la cărți pe care le primesc, care sunt scrise despre Sfântul Grigorie Palama.
I'm getting tired by this essence energies debate, which I find all the time.
Și deja am obosit să tot regăsesc această dezbatere între esență și energii, care apare mereu în aceste cărți.
I think Father Dumitru Stăniloae puts us in the right direction.
Și cred că Părintele Dumitru Stăniloae duce această discuție în direcția potrivită.
When he identifies the problem as one of the human person.
Atunci când identifică problema ca fiind aceea a persoanei umane.
And I hope our future research on all this can show us how Palamas had a polemical, he enjoyed polemics, unfortunately.
Și cred că vor fi alte cercetări care se vor face în viitor. Sfântul Grigorie Palama a avut o fire polemică.
But this was not what he was really about. He was really about communicating the Christian life. And I think Father Stăniloae is wanting to shift emphasis onto experience of God and the nature of the human person is the context in which we should discuss Palamas in future.
Dar cred că n-ar trebui să limităm pe Sfântul Grigorie Palama la latura aceasta polemică. De fapt, ceea ce el a dorit să comunice a fost despre viața creștină, despre cum ne putem apropia de Dumnezeu. Iar Sfântul Dimitrie Stăniloae tocmai ne pune oarecum pe calea corectă, pentru că el a vorbit despre experiența lui Dumnezeu în scrierile Sfântului Grigorie Palama și despre natura ființei umane în concepția sa.
Vă mulțumim foarte mult pentru aceste întrebări și pentru aceste răspunsuri extrem de clare. Deja timpul alocat acestui moment a fost depășit, o fi un semn bun, nu o fi așa de bun. Asta este. Va urma începând de la 11:10. Organizatorii sunt generoși și pauza o prelungesc un pic până la 11:10, când va începe sesiunea a 5-a, Teologie și Viață, unde protagoniști sunt părintele conferențiar dr. Nicolae Moșoiu și lector dr. Alexandru Prelipcean, iar dialogul va fi moderat de părintele asistent dr. Petru Cernat. Vă mulțumim tuturor!